Part 1. Hook. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1940, a young man walked into a fortified house in the Coyoacán district of Mexico City carrying a raincoat over his arm. The sky was clear. It had not rained in days, and it would not rain that evening. Everyone who later tried to reconstruct the scene came back to that detail because it was the one thing that should have stopped everything before it began. A coat folded over the arm on a dry, warm afternoon. A small wrongness, the kind of wrongness that a trained guard is supposed to notice and a man in love is supposed to forgive. Inside the folds of that coat were three things: an ice axe with its shaft sawn down to fit a man's forearm, a dagger, and a pistol. He had been to this house perhaps 10 times before. The guards knew his face. The wife of the man who lived there had served him tea. The great man himself, the second most important human being the Russian Revolution had ever produced. The founder of the Red Army, the exiled prophet with a price on his skull that spanned 2 continents, had come to think of this quiet, well-dressed young European as a harmless boy who was courting a woman in his circle, a little dull, a little too eager, politically vague in a way that was almost restful after years of zealots. The great man had no idea that the harmless boy had already tried to kill him once 3 months earlier and failed. He had no idea that the boy's mother was a Soviet agent, that the boy's handler had run assassination operations from Spain to Manhattan, that the boy had trained for this single act for the better part of 2 years, learning a false biography so thoroughly that he could recite the streets of a Belgian childhood he had never lived. He had no idea that the coat existed to hide an axe, and that the axe existed to open his skull. Here is the thing that makes this story different from almost every other assassination in the 20th century. The killer survived. He was caught in the act, in the room, with the weapon and the blood, and the victim still breathing and screaming. There was no mystery about who did it. And for the next 20 years in a Mexican prison, under interrogation by some of the most patient police in the hemisphere, that killer looked at the men across the table and refused, flatly, calmly for 2 decades to tell them his real name. He gave them a name. It was false. He gave them a life story. It was invented. He held to it through trial, through sentencing, through year after year in a cell, while intelligence services on 3 continents worked to pry his true identity out of the silence. When they finally cracked it, they did not crack it with a confession. They cracked it with a fingerprint taken a decade earlier, an ocean away, in a country that had already fallen. So consider the shape of what you are looking at. A man who committed the most famous political murder of his era in front of witnesses. A man whose guilt was never in doubt, and who still somehow remained a stranger to his own jailers for
20 years. And a body without a name, a hand without a history. Who was he, really? Who sent him? And how do you build a human being so completely that he will do this, take this, and give up everything? His freedom, his youth, his own name, and never once break? This is the story of Ramón Mercader. And to understand how a man becomes an axe in someone else's hand, you have to start long before the axe.
Lecture Part 2. The man the world thought it knew. For most of the years he mattered, the world did not know his name at all. That is the strange first fact of Ramón Mercader. The most famous assassin of the Cold War's opening act was, to the public, a nobody with a fake name and a shrug. When the Mexican police booked him, he was Frank Jackson, spelled wrong, missing the K, a clerical scar, and a forged Canadian passport that no one had bothered to fix. Before that, he had been Jacques Mornard, a Belgian playboy of vague wealth and vaguer politics. He spoke French like a Frenchman, Spanish like a Spaniard, and gave interviews in which he explained, with wounded sincerity, that he had killed the old man out of personal disillusionment. A love affair gone wrong, a betrayed disciple, a private grievance dressed up in political clothes. The story he told was almost admirable in its construction. He said the great man had tried to send him to Russia against his will. He said the great man had ordered him to abandon the woman he loved, to commit acts he found abhorrent, and that in a moment of anguish he had lashed out. A crime of passion, a lone, broken idealist. no masters. No mother, no handlers, no state. For years, that was the man on the record. A confused, jilted European who had done a terrible thing on his own account. The police did not believe it. The victim's widow did not believe it for a second. But belief is not proof, and Mercader had been built to withstand exactly this: the long grind of skepticism without evidence. He was a wall with a plausible face painted on it. Now hold that public image next to the truth, because the distance between them is the whole architecture of the thing. The truth was that Ramón Mercader was not Belgian, not Canadian, not a disillusioned drifter, and not acting alone. He was Spanish. He was a committed communist who had fought in the Spanish Civil War. His mother was a fanatical Soviet operative who had personally helped recruit and steer him toward this act. He answered to a senior Soviet intelligence officer who had spent years running exactly this kind of operation. And the man he killed had not been chosen by Mercader at all. He had been chosen at the very top of the Soviet state, marked for death by name in an operation with a code name, a budget, a backup team, and a second attempt held in reserve. Everything the public knew about him was a costume. The nationality was a costume. The name was a costume. The motive, the heartbroken lone wolf, was the most important costume of all, because it protected the one truth that mattered: that this was not a murder, it was a mission. And here is what should unsettle you. The costume worked for a very long time, not because it was brilliant, though it was competent. It worked because Mercader wore it without cracking. A false identity is only as strong as the nerve of the person inside it, and most people cannot hold a lie for a week under real pressure. Mercader held his for 20 years. The disguise did not fail. The man inside it never let it fail. So who was the man inside? Where do you find or make a person capable of that? You have to go back to a childhood that was itself a kind of ideological forge, and to a mother who is, in some ways, the more frightening figure of the two. Part 3. Where it begins. He was born in Barcelona in 1913 into a marriage that was already at war with itself. His father, Ramón Mercader, was a comfortable Catalan bourgeois, a man of property and convention, exactly the sort of settled, respectable figure the coming century would grind to powder. His mother was something else entirely. Caridad del Rio was born in colonial Cuba to a wealthy Spanish family, married upward and young, bore several children, and then, somewhere in the suffocating comfort of that respectable life, caught fire. You cannot understand Ramon without understanding Caridad, because in a real sense, she is the operation's true origin. She did not drift into radical politics. She detonated into them. She left her husband. She threw herself into the revolutionary left of Spain and France with an intensity that frightened even her comrades. A woman who seemed to have converted not just her opinions, but her entire nervous system to the cause. There are accounts of her that read less like biography and more like warning. Reckless, absolute. Willing to spend anything, including her children, for the revolution. And she had many children. Ramon was one of several. He grew up shuttling between countries and languages, Spain, France, absorbing French so completely in his schooling that it would later let him become a Belgian and then a Canadian without a seam showing. That accidental gift of language, the trilingual ease of a displaced bourgeois childhood, was the raw material an intelligent service dreams of. You cannot teach a grown man to sound native in 3 tongues. You can only find someone who already does. Picture the household. A mother incandescent with revolutionary purpose, treating political commitment not as a set of ideas, but as the whole meaning of existence, including the meaning of her sons. A father representing everything that world was supposed to sweep away. And in the middle, a boy learning very early that love and loyalty and belonging were things you earned by devotion to the cause. That the way to be worthy of his mother was to want what she wanted, absolutely. That is the psychological soil. Not a boy who chose an ideology as an adult after weighing the world, but a boy for whom the ideology and the mother were fused from the beginning, for whom pleasing her and serving the revolution were the same act and had always been the same act. Then came Spain's catastrophe, and the soil produced its crop. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, the whole family was already deep in communist politics. Ramon fought. He was, by the accounts that survive, a genuine soldier of the Republic and a committed party man. Not a cynic, not a mercenary, a believer who put his body where his convictions were. The war was the great crucible of the international left, and it was also, less visibly, the great recruiting ground and proving ground for Soviet intelligence. Spain, in those years, was crawling with Soviet advisors, NKVD officers, and operations that had as much to do with hunting heretics inside the left as with fighting the fascists across the line. That is the world Caridad moved in and moved her son into. It is where she met the man who would become the operations field commander. And it is where a fighting communist named Ramón Mercader stopped being merely a soldier and started becoming something rarer and colder. An instrument, selected, tested, and slowly turned toward a single human target he had never met. The revolution did not find Ramon as a stranger and persuade him. It had raised him. All that remained was to point him. Part 4. The Making of a Weapon. To turn a believer into an assassin, you need 3 things. You need a reason the state wants someone dead. You need an officer who knows how to run the machine. And you need a way in, a door into the target's life that the target himself will hold open. The reason came from the very top. The man marked for death was Leon Trotsky. You have to grasp what Trotsky was to Stalin because it explains the obsession, and the obsession explains everything that followed. Trotsky was not just a rival, he was the living alternative. He had built the Red Army. He had stood beside Lenin at the founding of the Soviet state. He was, to millions on the left around the world, the true keeper of the revolution's soul, the man who insisted that Stalin had betrayed everything and turned a workers' revolution into a police state ruled by a mediocrity. From exile, expelled from the Soviet Union, hunted from country to country until Mexico gave him shelter, Trotsky kept writing books, articles, a merciless, brilliant, unrelenting indictment of Stalin published to the world. Stalin could kill Trotsky's followers, and did by the thousands in the purges. He could erase Trotsky from photographs and history books. But he could not shut the old man's mouth as long as the old man was alive and writing in a house in Mexico. Trotsky was the one witness Stalin could not silence by decree. He had to be silenced by hand, so the order went out. Trotsky was to be eliminated. The operation was given a code name, Utka, the Russian word for duck, and its execution was handed to a man who was, by any measure, one of the most capable and dangerous intelligence officers the Soviet Union possessed, Naum Eitingon, who also went by Leonid. Eitingon was a professional's professional. He had run operations across Europe. He was calm, intelligent, ruthless, and completely without illusions. The exact opposite temperament to the fanatics around him, which is precisely what made him deadly. And Eitingon's connection to the Mercader family was personal. He and Caridad del Rio became lovers and partners in the work. The operation to kill Trotsky was, at its core, run by a woman and her intelligence officer companion, using the woman's own son as the blade. Sit with that for a moment. The field commander of the assassination was sleeping with the assassin's mother. The mother was steering her son toward the killing. This was not a cold, bureaucratic tasking passed down through anonymous channels. It was intimate. It was familial. The machine that pointed Ramón Mercader at Leon Trotsky ran on blood and on bed as much as on ideology and on Moscow's orders. Now the making of the weapon itself. Mercader was taken out of the role of ordinary party soldier and given a new life, layer by layer, the way you build a legend that has to survive contact with suspicious people. He became Jacques Mornard, a Belgian of independent means. The choice was surgical. His real French fluency made the Belgian cover unbreakable at the level that trips most agents up. The accent, the idiom, the reflexive things a person cannot fake under stress. He was given money, or the appearance of it. He was given the manners and the wardrobe of a bourgeois idler, a man with no strong politics, which is a very useful thing for a communist assassin to seem to have. The disillusioned drifter motive he would later use in prison was not improvised after the fact. It was built into the cover from the start. The lone, apolitical, heartbroken European was a costume sewn years before it was needed. And then came the door. You do not walk up to Leon Trotsky's fortified house and knock. By 1939 and 1940, the old man lived inside a bunker of his own making. High walls, watchtowers, guards, steel doors, a routine designed by people who knew that the most powerful state on earth wanted its occupant dead. You cannot force that door. You have to be invited through it. And to be invited, you need someone on the inside to vouch for you, to love you, to bring you home. Her name was Sylvia Ageloff. Part 5. The Craft of Getting Close. Sylvia Ageloff was an American, a social worker from New York, educated, serious, politically committed, a Trotskyist, part of the small, intense international movement that orbited the exiled prophet. Her sister worked for a time close to Trotsky's own circle. Sylvia was, in the language of the trade, an access agent, except she never knew she was an agent of anything. She was simply a real person with real convictions and a real human loneliness. And that loneliness was the door Mercader, as the charming Belgian Jacques Mornard met her in Paris. And here, you see the true craft of the operation, which was not violence at all. It was patience. It was the slow, deliberate, months-long manufacture of intimacy with a human being as a means to reach another human being she trusted. He courted her, not crudely, not fast. He was attentive, generous, worldly, a little mysterious about his money and his background in the way that reads as glamour rather than threat. He made himself into exactly the man a serious, somewhat overlooked young woman might not quite believe her luck to have found. The relationship became real to her. That is the part that should turn your stomach and command your attention at the same time. To her, every bit of it was real. The affection, the future, the trust. She was living a love story. He was executing an operation, and she was the terrain it crossed. Understand the coldness of the design. Sylvia was never the target, and in the operation's logic, never really a person. She was a corridor. Through her, Mornard gained a plausible reason to be in Mexico. Through her connection to Trotsky's world, he gained the thing money cannot buy. A face that the guards recognized, a name the household knew, a presence that raised no alarm. He did not force his way into Trotsky's life. He walked in on the arm of a woman who had every reason to believe he loved her, and every reason to introduce him to the people she admired most. Watch how carefully he built the presence, because this is tradecraft at its most patient. At first, he had no particular business at the house at all. He was just Sylvia's man, dropping her off, picking her up, hovering at the edges. He made himself familiar, ordinary, a fixture. He did small favors. He was pleasant to the guards, who were young men far from home, and pleasant to Trotsky's wife, Natalia. He built, week by week, the most valuable thing an assassin can possess, the appearance of belonging. By the time it mattered, his presence at the walls of that fortress provoked exactly nothing. He had become part of the scenery. The most dangerous man in Mexico had turned himself into furniture, and still, he did not strike. This is the discipline that separates a professional operation from a lone lunatic. He had access. He could get near the old man. But the plan at first was not for Mercader to do it with his own hand at all. Because before the axe, there were the machine guns. In May of 1940, a different plan came to a head. A raiding party, a squad of armed men led by the Mexican muralist and hardened Stalinist David Alfaro Siqueiros, dressed in police and army uniforms, overpowered the guards in the dark, poured into the compound, and raked Trotsky's bedroom with machine gun fire. Dozens upon dozens of rounds tore through the walls and the bed. It was meant to be the end. It failed. Trotsky and Natalia threw themselves into a corner on the floor, and by something close to a miracle, the storm of bullets passed over them. The raiders fled, believing they had done it. When the smoke cleared, the old man crawled out from under a hail of gunfire alive. Now think about what that failure meant for the operation, and for Ramón Mercader specifically. The loud plan, the frontal assault, the overwhelming force plan, it had been tried, and the target had walked away. The house would now be more alert, more frightened, more fortified than ever. Any second attempt would have to come not through the walls, but through the one gap that all the walls could not close. A trusted face already inside, that no one would think to search. The failure of the machine guns is the moment Ramón Mercader stopped being a backup and became the weapon. Everything that patient courtship had built, the familiarity, the recognition, the invisibility, was now the only card left to play. The quiet man who dropped off Sylvia was promoted by the failure of louder men to executioner. All he needed was a reason to be alone in a room with Leon Trotsky, and he found the oldest one there is. He asked the great man to read something he had written. Part 6, 20 minutes in August. By August of 1940, Mercader had done the small patient work of becoming a man whose opinions Trotsky might indulge. He had begun to present himself as someone drifting toward Trotsky's politics. A convert in progress, the most flattering thing a hunted prophet can be offered, and he had written an article, a political essay. He wanted the master to look at it, to correct it, to tell him where his thinking went wrong. For a writer in exile, largely cut off, endlessly betrayed, there is something almost impossible to resist in a young man who wants to learn. Trotsky was wary of him. Natalia liked him less, and something about the young man's manner unsettled her. But on the afternoon of August 20th, Mercader arrived with his typescript and his folded raincoat, and he was shown into the study. Reconstruct the room, because every detail of it was chosen or exploited. Trotsky sat at his desk. The younger man stood beside and slightly behind him, close, leaning in as the old man bent over the pages to read. It was an intimate posture, the posture of a student at a teacher's shoulder, and it was also, not by accident, the perfect posture from which to strike a seated man from above and behind. Mercader had positioned Trotsky exactly where he needed him, bent forward, absorbed, his back turned, his eyes down on the page of an essay written for no reason but to put him in that chair. The coat lay over the young man's arm. Inside it, the axe. What happened next, Mercader described later, and the physical evidence confirmed the shape of it. He drew the ice axe from the coat. He raised it. And he brought the pick down into the top of Trotsky's skull with all his strength, expecting, as the plan required, that a single blow would kill instantly and silently, that he would be able to walk back out through the house he knew so well and vanish into the city while everyone still thought the old man was reading. It did not work that way. Almost nothing about killing a human being works the way the plan says it will. The blow was terrible, but it was not instant, and it was not silent. Trotsky did not slump. He screamed, a long, wild animal cry that Mercader said he would hear for the rest of his life, and then the 60-year-old founder of the Red Army, with a pick buried in his skull, did the one thing no plan accounted for. He fought, he rose, he threw himself at his attacker, he bit down on Mercader's hand, he hurled objects, hurled himself, filled the house with noise and struggle, refusing with his whole ruined body to die quietly. The scream and the struggle destroyed the escape. Guards came running. And here, the trained assassin, the man built over years for exactly this moment, simply came apart because the plan had assumed a corpse, and instead there was a roaring, bleeding, living man and a house erupting around him. Mercader did not use the pistol in his coat. He did not use the dagger. He did not fight his way out. The guards seized him and began beating him, and as they beat him, he cried out something that gives the whole cold operation its one note of genuine, unbearable human truth. He shouted, in effect, that they were making him do it, that they had his mother, that he had been forced. In the collapse of the plan, for a few seconds, the weapon remembered it was a son. Trotsky, astonishingly, was still alive, conscious, lucid enough to stop his own guards from killing the assassin on the spot, because he understood, even then, bleeding from the head, that a dead assassin tells you nothing and a living one might tell you who sent him. He was carried out, operated on, and he lingered for a little more than a day. On August 21st, 1940, Leon Trotsky died. The operation had succeeded. The most hunted man of the revolution was dead by a Soviet hand, exactly as Stalin had ordered. But it had succeeded in the worst possible way: loud, botched, prolonged, and with the assassin taken alive in the room. Utka had killed the duck, and it had left its blade lying on the floor of the study for the entire world to pick up and examine. Now the second, stranger half of the story began. Not the killing, the silence. Part 7. The silence that lasted 20 years. Consider the position Ramón Mercader was in when the guards stopped beating him. He had been caught in the act of the most politically explosive murder of the age. The victim was a giant of world history. The eyes of every intelligence service, every newspaper, every government on earth were about to turn to the man in the cell. And that man was carrying a false name, a false nationality, and a false story. A costume that would now be tested not for a week, but, though he could not yet know it, for 2 decades. He put the costume on and he did not take it off. He was Frank Jackson. He was Jacques Morna. He was a Belgian, then a Canadian, of muddled biography and private wealth. He had acted alone, out of personal anguish. The jilted, disillusioned follower who had been ordered by the cruel old man to do things his conscience rejected, and who had snapped: no masters, no mother, no Etingon, no Moscow, no code name. A love story turned tragedy. He told this to the Mexican police, and he kept telling it in its essentials for 20 years. Think about what that silence actually required, because it is easy to say he stayed silent and missed the sheer inhuman weight of it. It required him to sit through interrogation after interrogation by police who knew he was lying and could not prove by whom he'd been sent. It required him to abandon his own identity, to let the world call him by a wrong name, to be a man without a verified past, to accept that even his jailers did not know who they were holding. It required him to protect the very people who had spent him, his mother who had steered him to this, Etingon who had run him, the state that had marked him, and would now, characteristically, leave him to rot in a foreign prison, while it looked after its own reputation. Everyone who had built the weapon walked away. The weapon stayed in the cell and covered for all of them, year after year after year, and it required him to do all of this alone, without applause, without acknowledgement, without any promise that anyone would ever know what he had endured. That is the part that defeats ordinary human nature. People can be brave for an audience. People can hold a lie when they believe rescue is coming. Mercader held his lie in silence in a Mexican prison through the entire Second World War and years beyond it, with no guarantee that the state he was protecting even remembered his name, or ever intended to. He was tried. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 20 years, close to the maximum Mexican law allowed. And he served them. Not a token stretch, not a quiet early release arranged by a grateful patron. The full weight of it, the best years of a man's life, spent in a cell guarding a secret that his own masters had abandoned him to keep. For years, the great unanswered question hung over him. Who is he? The Mexican authorities were certain the Belgian playboy story was fiction, certain there was a real man with a real name and a real state behind him, and completely unable to prove it. The costume held, the nerve held, the wall, with a painted face on it, did not crack. What finally cracked it was not the man. It was a piece of paper from a dead country. Investigators, working the identity for years, eventually traced a set of fingerprints. Not new ones, old ones, taken years earlier and an ocean away in Spain during the Civil War, when a young communist named Ramón Mercader had been arrested and printed by the authorities of the Spanish Republic. That republic no longer existed. It had been crushed, but its paperwork had survived. Scattered into archives, and somewhere in it was a card with the whorls of a young soldier's fingertips. The prints on the card and the prints of the silent prisoner in Mexico were the same. That is how the world learned his name. Not from a confession, not from a break in the silence. From a fingerprint taken in a country that had already fallen, matched to a man who had spent a decade refusing to be identified. The truth of Ramón Mercader was recovered the way you recover an artifact, dug up from an archive, not spoken by the man himself. He never gave them the name. They took it from the record of his own younger hand. And even after he was named, he did not repent, and he did not explain. He served out his sentence. He was released in 1960, after 20 years, and the state he had protected in silence finally, quietly, kept its side of the bargain, the way it kept such bargains, in the dark. Part 8. The Hunters. So who were the hunters here and who was the hunted? The story turns that question inside out, and that is the last thing worth sitting with. On the surface, the hunters were the Soviet state, the enormous apparatus of intelligence and murder that spent years, money, and lives to reach one old man behind a wall in Mexico. Stalin was the hunter. Attengon was the hunter, the professional who built and ran the machine. Caridad del Rio was the hunter, the mother who aimed her own son. And Ramón Mercader was the instrument of the hunt, the patient, disciplined blade that spent 2 years turning itself into furniture so that it could get close enough to strike. They caught their prey. Trotsky died as ordered. By the cold arithmetic of the operation, it was a success, and the men who ran it were, in time, rewarded. Attengon and Caridad were reportedly received in Moscow and decorated for the killing. The machine honored the machine, but look closer at who paid, and the shape of the hunt changes. Trotsky was hunted and killed, but he had, in a sense, already won the argument he cared about. His books survived. His indictment of Stalin survived. The murder that was meant to silence him instead made him a martyr and ensured that his version of the story, Stalin the betrayer, Stalin the gravedigger of the revolution, would be read for the rest of the century by the very people Stalin most wanted to keep from reading it. You can kill the witness. You cannot always kill the testimony. The axe reached the man. It never reached the words. And Mercader, the weapon, the hunter's hand, was in the end the most thoroughly consumed of anyone. Consider what the operation actually cost the man who carried it out. 20 years of his life in a cell. His name surrendered to silence, so that even history had to dig it out of an old police card without his help. His mother had spent him. His handler had spent him. His state had spent him, and then walked away and left him to serve every day of the sentence alone. When it was over, the reward came. But look at the form it took. He was made a hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest honor. And even that was given in secret, a medal for a deed that could not be named, to a man whose real name the state had spent 20 years helping to hide. He lived out his later years partly in the Soviet Union and partly in Cuba. And when he died in Havana in 1978, he was buried in Moscow under yet another name, Ramon Ivanovich Lopez, a false name in a Spanish childhood. A false name in a Mexican cell, a false name on a Moscow grave. The man who murdered the most hunted figure of the revolution was, from first to last, never quite allowed to be himself. The state that used him would not even let his headstone tell the truth. That is the terrible symmetry of it. To reach a man who would not stop speaking, the Soviet Union built a man who would not speak at all. Trotsky's whole life was testimony. Words, words, an endless refusal to be silent. Mercader's whole achievement was silence, a refusal for 20 years to say a single true word about who he was and who had sent him. The talker was killed by the silent man, and the silent man was, in his way, killed by his own silence long before his body died. Because he gave up the one thing a person cannot get back, which is the right to be known. So when you ask who the hunters were, hold all of it at once. A dictator hunting a rival, a spy master hunting a target, a mother hunting on behalf of a cause with her son as the arrow, and a young believer raised from birth to fuse love and loyalty and ideology into a single reflex who was hunted most successfully of all. Hunted, caught, and used up by the very people he trusted most and who ended his life honored, decorated, and buried under a name that was not his. The most hunted man of the revolution died in his own study, bent over a page written to trap him. But he was not the only prey in this story. He was just the one everyone was looking at. If a story like this one stays with you, stay with us.